Well, welcome back, and now we're going to focus on what will be kind of the core of this lecture, because the name of writing is developing the research problem. This is actually the part of the research problem. So usually you start thinking about the research problem once that you have a topic, but it is quite linked, because when you define your topic, as I told you, you have to have the literature and the theory close to your head, because even though that the topic definition is very empirical and the background of the introduction is very empirical, the next thing that comes is the research problem and the problematization, and that is very theoretical. So if you lost that, when you go back to the literature, then there is nothing. So you have to have something in there. So let's begin as kind of the same structure, kind of a very brief introduction about what is a research problem. We already talked about it even before, but a little bit more about that research problem and problematization is that the first thing is that it is totally based on theory. I wouldn't even say 99%, I would say 100% based on theory. Although it is inspired by empirics, because then the empirics it will allow you and give you inspiration on how to challenge the concepts, but it has to be theoretically based, right? Like there is no way that you are not going to use the literature to problematize something. That's why at this moment, and we will do an exercise about it, it will be difficult. We need to read first. The other thing is that the research problem is built through conceptual argumentation or theoretical argumentation. It is not that empirical. So the first section of the introduction is empirical because you chose the topic, but this is totally conceptual and theoretical. So you need to argue with concepts. So you can say like the concept of digitalization has focused entirely on the issue about technology use. That is what we see in this and this and this paper. But in an organizational level, the digitalization process is not only about technology. That concept of digitalization involves other things that have not been explored that deep, such as I don't know, the organizational structure. Like there is one paper who discussed that the changes on organizational structure through digitalization, but then they later forgot about the technology. Like they focus so much on organizational change. And then you talk about maybe that it also involves the digitalization also involves changes in maybe in routines. For example, the digitalization process also affects routinization. I don't know how that's a real concept, but it also affects routines. So the idea is that you are building the argumentation through concepts. Digitalization, the concept, you are problematizing that concept. Of course, it's inspired by real life, but all the arguments come from the literature. Like you need to mention this is what we have, what we know, and then we know that that is somehow relevant because there is also another study that explores this, but they haven't kind of put it in a holistic way, and it is worth to study digitalization in not just from the technology way or not only from the organizational way, but also kind of a holistic way between technology, organization, and psychology maybe. And then you have a holistic way to do it. And that's the proposal. Like I am challenging that we believe that digitalization is only about technology when it's not true. Or sometimes we even go to that part when we think that it's only about the organization structure, and it's also not true. It's kind of a trade-off between technology and organization. That's other idea of how, but you see, all of this is conceptual discussion. It's not that I am telling you, oh, Twitter is doing this and Apple is doing that, because sometimes that's what happens in real life conversations, right? Like we don't discuss in real life in the news about concepts. We discuss about, oh, Twitter is doing this and Apple is doing this. But here is about the concept of digitalization is being challenged through a conceptual argumentation. So connected to that point, it's again the idea of the challenge, the theoretical assumption. So you challenge, why do we believe that digitalization is all about technology? What are the assumptions behind it? Well, it is because digitalization involves a change in technology. That's true, but It's not enough. The challenge is on the assumption. It's not enough. The assumption is okay, but it's very simplistic. So it involves a change on technology, that's true, but it also involves a change on structures. It also involves a change on mindsets. And we previously have ignored that, or we have studied that separately, and we need to find an holistic way of studying it all together. So you challenge the assumption about the concept. And then another important thing is that, and this is very funny because when you read a thesis, sometimes the problematization is really well done. Sometimes it happens. Usually is the biggest problem in a thesis, but sometimes it's well done. And then they do the study, and then they go blah, blah, blah. And then their findings are this, but they never go back to the problem. Like they say, the problem is that we don't study digitalization when you have, of course, the change in technology, psychology, and organization. And then they do their study, and then they come back, and then they say, we found that the organizational change is important, and organizational change should be deeply thought, and it's dynamic. But what was the problem? Wasn't the problem that the research problem wasn't the problem that we have studied digitalization from independent areas, not connected, and didn't you try to solve that issue? So the problem has to be connected to the contribution of your thesis. So when you are done with your thesis, that's why I say at the very beginning that the research problem will guide you, because when you finish, you should be able to go back and check if you actually kind of solve the problem that you claim about, because you are not going to believe, but I think that 80% of the thesis forget to do that. Like they finish with something different. Of course, it's similar, but the problem is not the same. And that's maybe it's because they don't have time or something. I don't know, because it also requires time. Like you finish and then you say, okay, these are my findings. My contributions are possibly this. And then you need to go back to the problem, and probably you need to change the problem. I think all the time you will need to somehow also, because it's almost impossible that you won't change your problem from the very beginning until the end. You will, it's again an iterative process, so you need to kind of fix the problem in there. It's maybe in the end it was very difficult to test or to study the psychological thing, so maybe drop the psychological thing and then focus only on organization and technology. But then when you finish, it has to be very coherent. So remember, and one way to look at it is that the references that you use to problematize should also be part of your contribution. We're going to talk about that when we go to the contribution. But if you are saying like this study studied the digitalization process only in technology and it ignored the organization, and this other study studied the digitalization from the organization perspective and forgot about technology, and there is not kind of like a link between the two, and that's the problem. When you think about the contribution and when you write about the contribution, you need to cite these papers again. So you say, my paper contributes to these two papers by combining their conceptual ideas. And then what I found is like there is a trade-off between technology and organic, and that's a great contribution. That's fantastic contribution. You can even publish that probably, depending on how well you did on the method, but we'll talk about that later. But remember, go back. So check if the references from the contribution, we'll check that later, are in the research problem. So the point is, don't forget about the research problem. You need to go back to the problem at the middle. Well, you can go back all the time, but you have to keep that thing alive. It's like a plant. Like it's not like you finish and then you leave it. Sometimes that in practice that happens, and that's very bad. But sometimes you finish your first chapter, you leave it, and then you never come back. You need to come back and then to reflect how the problem has changed or what's going on. Okay, well, and then finally, some people will say that the research problem or your objective should be finding a gap. I don't know if you have heard that word, but in academia it's very popular. Find a gap. Find something that we haven't studied yet. So as I said, we haven't studied, I don't know. I don't even know if this example is true. So also be careful. I'm just giving a random example about digitalization, but maybe we know about digitalization in technology and organization, And the gap is that there is not a study that studies the both technology and organization. So the gap is that. But the gap is not enough. It's not enough to say, oh, we haven't studied how teachers that are Mexicans but live in Sweden behave when they receive a bonus. We haven't studied yet. I'm pretty sure we don't have a study about Mexican teachers living in Sweden and then they receive a bonus. I'm pretty sure that doesn't happen. But why should we study that? You need to justify. So in that, if I go back to the digitalization, in the research problem, you need to claim that there might be something interesting conceptually about this gap. Maybe it is that it's not as simple as just the combination. Maybe it is that the combination results in tension, and that tension can bring innovation, maybe. Who knows? That's what you need to argue conceptually. And in the case of the Mexican teachers, maybe is that we as Mexican teachers believe that bonuses are kind of corruption because our country is very corrupt. So we don't like bonuses because they are linked to corruption. So maybe in our mindsets, bonuses are perceived as something from corruption and we don't like that. And then the effect is not positive, but maybe negative if we receive a salary in Sweden, and we also have to argue for the Swedish part. But so as you see, it's very difficult to, or not difficult, but it's complex. It's not as simple as saying, we haven't studied this. Well, okay, but so the thing is that the research problem is a combination of the gap spotting, but also the problematization. And remember, the problematization is justifying why we need to study that conceptually. So it is, we haven't studied that in this specific combination or whatever. And also, it is interesting because of this, and this is not as simple as we haven't done it. So in the next video, we're going to talk about some strategies to problematize some issues. Okay, so that's the end of this video.